Okay, picking up where we left off. Chapter 19, he starts talking about Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist, and his kind of opposition to W.E.B. Du Bois, who worked with the NAACP, which Jones paints as kind of like this Jewish organization, and he cites people like Harold Cruse on this kind of friction between blacks and Jews in the organization, where Jews were took kind of like a leading role and blacks saw it as kind of patronizing. And this was all happening in Harlem because of the Great Migration northwards from the south of black people around the time of World War I. Franz Boas was a part of this scene and was influential in the NAACP. I believe I went over this same thing when I reviewed Kevin McDonald's immigration chapter from his book, so I'll link that. And also, not that I like the guy, but I think the dude, I forget his name, the guy who does the Martyr Made podcast also did a podcast on like blacks and Jews, so I guess you could look that up for more like research purposes if you're interested. Jones describes Garvey as kind of a black Zionist and has this funny anecdote of Marcus Garvey at a conference reading out this letter from a Jewish Zionist guy saying that Jews should have control of Palestine and blacks should have control of Africa. Obviously, this was at a time of like colonialism and stuff, which Garvey was reading with, positively to the crowd. And then he also talked about how he was going to send a letter out to this like Irish revolutionary and talked about how Ireland should be free for the Irishmen. So kind of like that funny meme of like Africa for the Africans, Europe for the Europeans, but it's like Israel for Jews, Ireland for Irish, Africa for blacks. I don't know, I thought that was kind of funny. But really the kind of conflict that arose between people like Garvey and others from the NAACP, notably Du Bois, was kind of the same thing going on between Malcolm X and MLK, kind of generically, that Garvey was more of a radical. He didn't want integration where Du Bois did. I believe Garvey even insulted Du Bois as kind of like a mixed race person. I don't know. I think Du Bois had some white ancestry and Garvey was like pure black. I'm not super interested in this topic, so I'm just kind of like breezing through because it's just like whatever to me. But apparently Jews at the time thought Garvey was kind of anti-Semitic, even though Garvey in a sense was just saying that, oh, like black people should be like the Jews, like they should have their own autonomy, their own kind of economic system, their own land, as it were. And, at this time, like obviously black people were going through it in the US and I mean in Africa, like, I don't know, besides Ethiopia, like everything was owned and controlled by European powers. But anyway, there was just that kind of friction between different black activists going on in the early 20th century, in the US at least. In typical Jones fashion, he shifts the attention away from Garvey, even though the chapter is called Marcus Garvey, and just starts talking about Jews directly and how the 20th century became a Jewish century in the US, adopting the name from the author of the book, The Jewish Century, by Yuri Slezkin, and discusses how Jews were leaders of the nascent Hollywood industry and that a lot of early Hollywood films were basically pornographic, and Henry Ford called it out. And then Jones kind of just turns back to Garvey again. I don't really see the connection here, so I don't know. It was kind of like abrupt to me when I first read it. I'm just reading off my old notes. And he basically kind of ends the chapter just talking about how like Garvey's plans to go back to Liberia failed, and he was sentenced to prison for mail fraud, I guess kind of brought on by the urging of NAACP leaders because they didn't like his overall movement and philosophy. So Garvey eventually was put into prison, but like pardoned later and just like deported back to Jamaica. And I guess Jones' whole point in this is that Garvey was trying to have like Zionism for black people, but Jews didn't like it, I guess, is kind of the main theme. So that's that chapter. Okay, chapter 20, we have the Scottsboro Boys grape case. In my old notes, I barely have anything on this, and I just kind of wrote that it wasn't a chapter that really interested me. I guess that the Communist Party of the USA was involved in defending a group of black teens who were accused of rape of two white women, and apparently the court case, the NAACP and the CPUSA kind of had a feud over how to operate the case or whatever. I don't think Jones throughout this chapter, I'm trying to recall and I'm just skimming through, I don't really care that much about this chapter. I don't think he's saying that like these boys did do the grape, because I mean if you just do like a cursory search, it seems like they were pardoned later on and stuff, but just that the CPUSA and NAACP were trying to use it as a tool to like recruit blacks into the communist movement, or just like into like black radical politics and stuff, but like on Jewish terms, as Jones would have it. And basically all of the communist agitation surrounding the case just kind of made the actual verdict of guilty versus non-guilty not like the big issue in people's minds, especially in the South. I forget if I mentioned it, but it was in the South where this was taking place, and it was kind of reminiscent of the Leo Frank case where people saw like Northerners and basically Jews like from the North going into the South and trying to, push their weight around, as it were. And Jones posits that the Jews were kind of trying to, in a way, take Christianity out from the black man because it taught him how to, pray and forgive and all that kind of stuff. And the Jew wanted to put communism into the black man instead. He mentions Frederick Douglass here and how like some Jewish guy had Frederick Douglass read like Jewish communists like Marx and stuff. He mentions Harold Cruse talking about the end of the black-Jewish relationship that happened in the Harlem riots in the 30s. I just don't really care that much about this chapter or like the black-Jewish relationship stuff. To be frank, just personally, I think it's kind of overkill. I mean, it's a pretty uncharitable take on the Jews, and like he almost kind of has this black people have no agency, like no one has agency except the Jews. And even portraying a classic case of like a racialized event in the South involving blacks and whites as just kind of, oh, the Jews are the most important group here. I don't know, I would say at least like each group should have like a third of like the importance, like a third for Gentile whites, third for Jews, third for blacks, if you're gonna make this weird kind of calculus about it. But anyway, I don't really want to focus on this too much, so I'm gonna move to the next chapter. Okay, moving on to the last chapter of this review. Also, I kind of realized that if someone really wanted to, they could just ask ChatGPT to summarize each chapter, and it'd probably do a better job than myself. So, I don't know if I'm going to keep doing this. I'm not super interested in a lot of the chapters of this book. Maybe I'll pick out some that I want to do specifically later on, or maybe I'll do them all, or maybe I just won't do any more. We'll see about it. But anyway, moving on to chapter 21. Entitled Revolutionary Music in the 1930s. I guess the Communist Party wanted to like make overtures to working class Americans. Earl Browder talked about like this communism in American 20th century or something like that, blah, blah, blah. Again, I'm just not that interested because it doesn't even really involve Jews. Like a lot of the people he's naming aren't Jews and they're just like these folk singers. So I don't really know why he's talking about it. I guess like the communists wanted to reach out to Gentiles who were not obviously Jewish to play folk music for them or something. He mentions Woody Guthrie later on, who was well known for his anti-fascist rhetoric and anti-Hitler rhetoric. Again, I don't really know why he brought this up. In my notes, I mentioned that I was like skipping a lot of this because I just don't really see the point of highlighting it. He brings up the famous Catholic priest radio personality Father Coughlin, and then also Charles Lindbergh, both of whom were kind of anti the U.S. being involved in World War II, kind of Jew aware, as it were. He discusses how some Jews broke off from the communists after World War II, and kind of like this new liberalism emerged as a counter to communism and Stalin. He points to a WASP-Jewish alliance in an effort to kind of block Christianity's role, most notably Catholicism's role in American public life, and talks about how prominent Jews were prominent in kind of secularizing American life regarding like schools and whatnot. I don't know, I'm just totally like just generalizing here, but I would actually also kind of agree with that. I think Kevin McDonald brought up a similar point. I do think that like Jews, because they're the one kind of non-Christian religious group in the US, did make a lot of headway and like activism in terms of, secularization of school and public life and stuff. He brings up Arthur Koestler, who, along with other formerly communist writers, wrote a collection of essays called The God That Failed, talking about how communism failed, as it were. And he brings him up as an example of like kind of a post-communist Jew who got disillusioned with communism, most notably because Stalin was kind of anti-Semitic, but also just like other like illiberal tendencies of the Iron Curtain countries. And Jones says that Koestler unalived himself because he was like looking into the non-Semitic origins of the Ashkenazis in his book, The 13th Tribe. He's like pretty popular for promoting the Khazar theory of Ashkenazi origins, which I think is kind of funny and why you should take everything Jones says with a grain of salt. He did not kill himself because of like researching this book. He killed himself because he had some like terminal illness, and so he committed suicide along with his wife. You could like look that up. And yeah, Khazar theory is like totally debunked anyway, so I don't even think Jones believes in it, but certainly not like other, Jew woke people. So kind of funny throwaway line he has in there. He then briefly touches on the Rosenberg trial and the outcome of the trial where the Rosenbergs were hanged, and it was basically like a Jewish judge, Jewish prosecutor, so it was kind of like a good milestone for Jewish separation from communism and from Stalinism, and how he mentions like Stalin turned on the Jews, as it were. I'm really just like breezing by this chapter. It's not super in depth. And he somehow ties it back into Woody Guthrie and folk music at the end. Don't ask me why. I don't know. I'm done with this chapter and done with the video. Peace.